Welcome to Free Thought Matters. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Annie Laurie and I are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is the nation's largest association of freethinkers. That means atheists and agnostics, working to keep church and state separate. And we invite you to become a member. You can join us at ffrf.org.
And today we are delighted to have in studio with us a champion of the First Amendment, a primary source in the most important state church lawsuit ever won before the U.S. Supreme Court. It's known as the McCollum case, handed down in 1948.
Daniel McCallum was a young boy in the 1940s when his mother filed her controversial lawsuit to halt religious indoctrination classes in the public schools in Champaign, Illinois. And Daniel has written a book with the inside story of that Supreme Court precedent-setting McCallum ruling. The book is called The Lord Was Not on Trial.
So thank you so much, Dan, for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, before we talk about this, because it was a complicated case, we want to show a clipping of your mother from a film that we did many years ago called Champion of the First Amendment. And there's also a cameo with your brother Jim, who was a primary plaintiff in the case. So let's look at that.
We have 3 sons. When the oldest one was in the 4th grade, he ran into this program of religious education in the school, public school, on school time. He came home with a note from the teacher that we were supposed to sign, give him permission to participate. We didn't approve of it. We thought that it was religious indoctrination. It was the sort of thing that shouldn't be in public schools. And also we didn't want the religious training in any case. So we kept him out of the class until the peer pressure became so great. Even the public school teacher called and asked that we permit him to participate. Finally, we let him take the course for a few weeks, and we saw that it was pure and simple religious indoctrination. It wasn't a course in general morality and good, wholesome, happy living. And so we took him out of the course. The pressure continued, and when it came to the point that we couldn't resist it, I took it to court.
Being the only child who didn't participate was a bit lonely, and generated a great deal of hostility from the students and to some extent from the teachers.
So Dan, Jim was your older brother, correct? You were the middle brother. So you were a little more peripheral to the lawsuit, but you still went through the whole thing, endured a lot. And I remember you made a comment once about your mother and her fortitude in taking this case, about the school board not knowing who they were dealing with.
And every once in a while, history gets a little discomfort by having somebody surface who is a little more than they can handle.
So they didn't know who they were tussling with.
That's probably a good explanation.
And so what was your mother like? I mean, this took a great deal of fortitude.
Well, she was a quick thinker. She had a good education. And I remember how many times during the law case and afterwards she said, I knew I was right.
And she was.
Well, 9-1, the Supreme Court, 8-1, the Supreme Court thought so too.
Yeah, she lost at the first level, she lost at the second level, and then she won that landmark case before the U.S. Supreme Court.
With one dissenter.
Well,
Yes.
she was right. Constitutionally, she was right.
So we want to talk a little bit more about what it was like for you, but first we do also have a clipping of you from 30 years ago talking about your mother and talking a little bit about the meaning of the case. So let's go to that.
After dark, a crowd of teenagers approached the door singing "Onward, Christian Soldiers" and had a long post or a board and began banging it into our front door, which was a very substantial front door. But as I recall, it shook the house. At least my memories might have been exaggerated over time, but it was a rather scary situation. And it reached a point where my mother opened the door to be greeted by a barrage of vegetables and rotten vegetables and other debris. And my mother is not a person who cries much or prone to breaking down, but I think that experience really did lay her flat. It was a program which took time, and it was an inconvenience to the school day and routine. But a more serious problem was that at the very outset, a religious census was conducted to find out what numbers of students were, what the population was, religiously speaking, and it segregated from the very outset, just from this preliminary religious census, on through the actual conduct of the classes, segregated people by their religious beliefs. No longer was it any secret whether you were Jewish or Catholic or, in our case, atheist. So I think that in terms of actually invading a essential public area, as education is, and segregating people out by religious beliefs, that it definitely was a very, very un-American intrusion into the system. Unfortunately, the public, I think, started out confused and remained confused as to what my mother's contention really was. The facts of the case were that it was, her contention was that it was an unconstitutional violation of the separation of church and state for sectarian religious groups to come into the school and offer classes, especially on school time. The public, on the other hand, perceived this as an attack upon religion.
So you were in the middle of this as the middle child, and what was it like during that lawsuit? How old were you? What was it like kind of growing up in the middle of this?
Well, it started when I was 9. The interesting thing about it is it set people apart. It identified you in a very public way that you were different from the other kids. When the clip explained that they had to do a census to see what class to send you to, whether you were Catholic or Protestant or Jewish, or what I was, which was, I guess, nothing at all. And so you were already in a very, it was a difficult time. It was right after World War II. Atheist communism was, the Red Scare was all bundled into this. And so we were very isolated. I was particularly isolated. Jim, on the other hand, was actually so abused that they had to ship him out of town.
So you went to stay with your grandfather and grandmother?
Right. But for me, I had to leave the class once a week while the rest of them stayed to have this Protestant class. It was and the Jewish kids had the same problem. They suffered the same kind of impacts I did because they didn't take the class either, even though the Jewish community had agreed to go along with this program. They had really dropped out because there were so few of them at the time, and they just quit. So I was it.
In the preface to the book that you wrote, your brother Jim writes that you boys were being harassed and chased, but one of the Jewish boys was actually beat up and his glasses were broken, and there was a real violence happening then.
Yes, and the book does a very good job of describing the situation with the Jewish community. They were in a position of being damned if they did or damned if they didn't. I mean, they just went along with it, not to create a wave, but they were very reluctant about it.
So tell us about the book and the title, The Lord Was Not on Trial.
On the first day of the trial, a young man approached the superintendent of education and indicated that he'd come to testify for the Lord. Again, this public misperception of what was going on. And the dignified superintendent said he'd have to talk to our attorney, Mr. Franklin. So he walked over and announced that he'd come to testify for the Lord. Franklin was kind of a tall, Lincoln-esque-like looking guy. And I remember him, I don't remember him, the story was told by somebody who was there. He said, "The Lord is not on trial here today." And it was such a good, concise statement of what the issue wasn't. It was not a trial of the Lord, although our attorney did pursue it in a way that was appeared to be a challenge to current religious beliefs.
And so you lost at that trial level and then at the appeals court, but you got a new attorney at that point.
Had to, right?
Yeah. And so your book goes through everything, a chronology day by day, correct?
Well, there's certainly a background where I try to say how it affected my life, but that was the short part. I really wanted to tell the story of the case. Vashti had previously written a book entitled One Woman's Fight.
That's right.
Which was a memoir. It was a personal outlaying of her own experiences and thoughts during the case.
And we republished that book.
Right, and it was right after the trial, so it was really current. I never, when I wrote my book, had to interview her because it was all there. But I had clips that had been saved and sent from all over the country. And particularly the Chicago newspapers, they were all there. And it was a fascinating assembly of material that I had to work with.
So we're going to take a break in a minute, but there was an editorial when you won that case. It was huge. It was all over the country. It was nationwide publicity, but a rather shocking editorial in the Progressive. And what about your brother? And what did it say?
Well, Milton Mayer, who was a regular at the Progressive, was permitted a little bit of latitude, in fact, quite a bit, according to the editors, who wrote a little piece saying, hey, we didn't really want to do this, which was entitled that the Supreme Court has granted James Terry to McCallum permission to go straight to hell.
Permission, a 12-year-old can go straight to hell now because of the Supreme Court.
Right.
Quite a decision, or quite a commentary on the discrimination against non-believers and the misunderstanding of separation of church and state. Now, we are going to come back and we are going to talk about a way in which you were very vindicated in your hometown, where your family at that time were real pariahs because of the lawsuit, how you got elected as the most outspoken atheist in the community, as a very popular mayor.
Well, I wasn't the most outspoken, but I was the best known.
Okay, best known atheist in Champaign, and how you got elected mayor. So we'll be right back with an interview with Dan McCallum, and a champion of the First Amendment.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist, and I'm alarmed by the intrusions of religion into our secular government. That's why I'm asking you to support the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics, working to keep state and church separate, just like our founding fathers intended. Please support the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
I'm Doug Hinahara, and I'm an out-of-the-closet atheist. I consider myself fortunate in that I wasn't raised in an overly religious family, so I was allowed to think for myself. And around the time I was 17, as I was exploring these ideas of religion, I was told by a fundamentalist Christian that my grandmother, who had emigrated from Japan, was destined to eternal damnation because she was a Buddhist. And I couldn't accept that, and it kind of unraveled from there for me. So at this point in my life, I've become very comfortable with the idea that I don't need religion or belief in God to be a moral person and live an ethical life. I'm proud of the fact that I have 2 daughters who have grown up to be wonderful young women, and I'm proud to say also atheist.
Thank you for watching Free Thought Matters. You can find more content by the Freedom from Religion Foundation at our website, ffrf.org. Follow FFRF on Facebook, and you'll get notifications about all of our content, including whenever we go live on FFRF's Ask an Atheist. FFRF is also on YouTube, where all of our programs, including this show and our weekly news bites, are available to watch anytime. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you on the web.
And we are back with Daniel McCallum, who's written a fascinating book about his family's historic landmark lawsuit. It's called McCollum versus Board of Education, which was handed down in 1948, more than 70 years ago. It was the first decision by the U.S. Supreme Court against religious indoctrination in our public schools. The McCallum case is the decision upon which all subsequent court cases against school prayer and religion in school is based.
So we want to talk a little bit more about that, the importance of that decision and the law. And as you grew up, you must have realized it.
At the time, of course, it was right after World War II, and there was this very intense feeling of communism and atheistic communism, and so that really aggravated the temper of the times. But over time, of course, the university tripled and quadrupled in size, and people from the outside came in from transforming Champaign-Urbana and from a rather provincial, nice engineering and agriculture school into a major university. And so it was, in the end, something of a making a somewhat celebratory status.
So I know that you told me before the show that both you, when Jim was forced to move out of town because it was impossible for him to stay during the trial and during waiting for the decision, when he did come back after you won, and he went to a special university or a special high school run by the university, so that kind of helped him, and then you followed suit. And then you're saying the town was kind of transformed, but you were still very well known as an atheist. The case was very well known. But in the late 1980s, as I said, you had a kind of vindication because you were able to run for mayor and win. And you served how many terms?
Served 3 terms, in fact, till I couldn't stand it any longer.
And you beat a priest, right? Wasn't the former mayor a priest?
He had been a priest, yes.
And I think that you were on the city council before that, and you had talked with the mayor, the ex-priest, about the fact that the city was starting its meetings with prayer.
Invocation was part of the regular outline of the agenda. And I had asked him to continue the practice of the previous mayor, a lady who had omitted the invocations and substituted a moment of silence. And I asked him to continue it. He declined. He kind of reverted to form.
Yeah. So you ran against him.
That wasn't the reason, total reason I ran against him, but I did run against him, definitely.
And you won.
And I won.
And then what did you do about the prayer?
Well, it became a moment of silence again, and that was that. There wasn't any discussion. I just ended it.
And was there any controversy about ending it?
Well, during the televised debate on it, I was asked that question by somebody who was watching the program and asked if I was going to continue to eliminate the invocation. And I said I had a hard time going to the extent of asking the Lord to take any responsibility for what we were likely to do in the meeting.
With potholes and sewer management and budgets and, yeah.
It seems so ridiculous that people think if there were a God, that God would care about...
Anyone who wants to take any responsibility, what politicians are going to do, shouldn't ask the Lord to take any responsibility.
And I know that state church didn't really become much of an issue during your terms as mayor, but the pledge was being said, and you didn't stop that, and that's pretty hard to stop at a city council meeting. But you did kind of protest it a little bit, didn't you?
Well, I certainly don't say under God, and Jim, I think, says something, adds a little something. I just was quiet. You have to make some compromises when you're in this position, and I made as few as most anybody could expect me to make.
And you said that everyone noticed that you weren't mouthing under God. They would turn and look.
Oh, they were looking for it.
Yeah. But you proved to be a very popular mayor nevertheless.
Well, I was reelected twice, and probably if I could have stood another term, but it was a drag. I think I just kind of worn the council out.
Do you think the fact that your family went through this very high-profile case, you were watching the news, you were in the courtroom all the time, and your book details every single day of the trial, do you think that influenced you and your brothers to get involved in the law and in civil government and politics?
Well, certainly my older brother did become a lawyer.
Yeah.
I took enough of law school to understand that, at least personally, that it wasn't for me. I went on to do other things.
Well, you have two undergraduate degrees, but one is in political science.
Correct.
And then a master's, so you have a very highly educated family. Your father was a professor.
Well, he was a PhD. He was the first and only member of his family to go that far, but 11 kids of that family all went to college.
Now, tell us a little bit about your family background in terms of religion.
Well, my mother was baptized a Lutheran, but one day she came home from Sunday school and was asking her mother if she was concerned about this damnation and punishment and so forth. And my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, said, "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that." And she never did. That must have been it, because neither of my parents were, they weren't anti-religious, they just weren't religious. We just didn't, Sundays we did other things.
One thing I like about reading both of your books, your mother's book and your book, is it shows that your family was a very close-knit, happy, loving, fun family, and you were very secure in your non-belief, and didn't that help to have such a supportive family through all of that?
Well, non-belief wasn't an issue until the law case, but I never felt uncomfortable about the problem afterwards, and neither has anybody else. They've all been very, very solid in their secular attitudes. It was just a very, very nice family, however, and without it, it would have been a very, very difficult trial, I can tell you. The support that I had in my family, and it continues to this day to another 2 generations, it's been a pretty outstandingly solid family.
Now, it was a terribly controversial situation there in Champaign in the late 1940s, but I think that your mother had often said, despite what happened, she would do it. She would have done it all over again, and I'm assuming you feel the same way.
Well, first of all, once you get into the Worldstrom, like crossing a flooded river, and you get partway across, and you think, "Oh, this is too bad. I got to turn around." She's ducked her head, and I mean, it's a feeling that I have had the rest of my life. If I thought I was right, I was going to go, and I was going to go down with it. I was going to have the sails set and the paddles flying.
And she did it to protect her children. I mean, it created more, it made you targets, but she wanted to be sure that your freedom of conscience was protected, that you weren't being indoctrinated in our public schools.
Well, she was concerned about her own children, but however, she felt that the issue itself, which she had expressed some concern over to the Unitarian minister at the time, we weren't members at the time, but she had expressed it, that it was a serious constitutional issue.
And indeed it is.
And indeed it is.
And that brings us to the fact that with the changes on the U.S. Supreme Court, unfortunately, the McCollum case, which is really the bedrock on which all of the Establishment Clause cases in our schools rests on, is very much endangered. I mean, we have the religious right and the Christian nationalists saying they want to put prayer back in school, religion back in school. Why is it so important that the McCallum case should stand?
Well, I think the stand is fairly secure in that public attitudes have changed considerably. I mean, when you take a look at the number of nuns,
Yes.
the so-called non-believers, we're up towards 30% now. This is a younger generation. It's a whole different ballgame for these people. They're struggling to try to make sure that they can stay alive, and I think they're probably right. They need to struggle to stay alive.
But so why is it so important that this case should stay?
Well, I think it puts a bedrock, makes a bedrock statement as to just to what extent the public can participate in the public sector without being barraged by mandatory religious beliefs and prayers and so forth.
And you have talked a little bit on the tape that we showed about the fact that it segregates children. It brings attention to religious differences. It creates walls between children that didn't exist before.
The preamble of the Constitution says the people of the United States, the people of the United States. And what that means is everybody. It doesn't mean white males. It doesn't mean Christians. It means everybody. And so when you go in the public forum, you should be able to feel secure as anybody else, whether you're an atheist or a Catholic. It doesn't matter. You're there because you have a right to be there.
I remember your mother saying, when the state Supreme Court came down with a bad decision against you, your mother said to them, you should read the Constitution. She said to the justices, you know. And I think she would say the same thing to the current Supreme Court. They should actually read the Constitution.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, for being part of this landmark case, for documenting it in your book. That McCollum case is the bedrock on which all of this law against religion in our public schools rests. It's so important that it be maintained, and it's so important that people understand this law.
It's a colossal pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Daniel McCallum, and thank you for watching Free Thought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.